Hi, everybody. My name is Megan Kuikman. I'm a registered dietitian and a sports nutrition researcher, and you're listening to the Physical Performance Show, and we're talking about disordered eating and relative energy deficiency in sport.
Megan Kuikman, registered dietitian and sports nutrition researcher. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you for having me here.
Megan, we've been online buddies, if you like, for several years since you were conducting research with prior Expert Edition alumni of the show, Dr. Margot Mountjoy, who shared around relative energy deficiency in sport. That was now 2 years ago at the time of this recording. Margot's episode was 232 and of the show, and you were involved in a study that required 1,000 participants to complete a survey, ideally, and that's how we first connected. And now you're in Australia with your PhD work at the Australian Catholic University. So it's been a busy few years for you amongst COVID aside.
Yeah, it really has been. And I have to say, it's fun to be on this side of the mic. I've been a big fan of the podcast and often listen. So it's given me lots of time to figure out what my physical challenge is going to be for listeners.
All right. Well, we wait for that with great anticipation now, Megan. Megan, but the topic for today's focus for conversation is this concept or term of disordered eating. And we're speaking specifically around disordered eating in sport and elite sports settings. This is obviously a big part of your registered dietitian background and also a part of your research interests in many ways. Can you put some perspective around disordered eating in terms of a definition? Like people, what does that even mean?
Yeah, it's a complicated definition, just because eating behaviors really do lie on a spectrum, with normal eating behaviors on one end of the spectrum and a clinical eating disorder on the other end of the spectrum. But in between is disordered eating, which is very prevalent, especially among athletes. And this really is problematic eating behaviors that are interfering with an athlete's, it could be physical and or mental health. And really, there's many different problematic eating behaviors that could make up disordered eating. And this may change with time and change in severity, and it can really easily spiral into a full-blown eating disorder.
So I think a key concept there, Megan, is that this exists on a continuum from normal fueling or eating behaviors through to a diagnosed, what most people would appreciate as an eating disorder, is something that's been medically diagnosed under strict criteria, the DSM-5, I believe. But in the middle is this more, I guess, ubiquitous term of disordered eating. And you mentioned that it's made up of eating behaviours, maladaptive eating behaviours. What are some of these behaviours that coaches, athletes, practitioners, parents, all stakeholders in sport need to have some awareness of?
Yeah, and I'm glad you're bringing this up, because I think for a lot of these problematic eating behaviors, it can be normalized and often overlooked when they are problematic and interfering. And in some cases, people that are participating in these behaviors don't even know that they're problematic. So this could be things like cutting out whole food groups, being scared of eating certain foods. So maybe it's an athlete that won't eat any carbs out of fear of carbs making them gain weight or slow down. It could be going long periods of time without eating. It could be consciously restricting food and not listening to hunger cues. It could also be more related to exercise as well. So things like engaging in extra exercise as a way to burn more calories and manipulate food, or being fearful on rest days or days when an athlete isn't exercising of eating, or thinking that they can't eat because they haven't exercised that day. So there's many different types of behaviors that could make up disordered eating. And it can really differ from athlete to athlete, but really at the core of it is that it's impairing physical and mental health.
It's impairing physical and mental health. and the impairment comes from the consequence of these eating behaviors result, I guess, a state of not enough energy being available or low energy.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
But yes, it's fair. Sometimes the problematic eating behaviors can lead into not enough calories being consumed, but that's not always the case. Sometimes these athletes can have problematic eating behaviors and still be eating not enough energy, but it could still be interfering with their health, as is the case with somebody with binge eating disorder or overeating disorder, which would be disordered eating. But in that situation, it might not be leading to inadequate energy intake and all the problems that occur with that. And I think as we're really focusing on, a lot of it has to do with mental health as well, and the psychological impairments that come with these disordered eating behaviors, because it could be interfering with things like the ability to eat with others and socially connect over food, and those other things. So certainly some of the health outcomes of disordered eating can be related to inadequate calorie intake or poor nutrition, but there's other components as well that aren't necessarily related to energy intake.
So disordered eating and not enough energy being available or low energy availability, they can occur together, but they can also occur in isolation. As you said, it's not just about low energy states. It can be about also poor nutrition, for example, as well. Yeah.
And just as disordered eating doesn't always relate in low energy availability can occur without disordered eating, in the case of an athlete that just isn't aware of how much energy they need. But they're also closely related at the same time, because the inadvertent development of low energy availability can actually precipitate and cause disordered eating. So even though they can occur in isolation, one can also lead to the other.
Yeah, it's an important point, and for us to be aware of and mindful of. Megan, in terms of the health and performance consequences, actually, Meg, so I'm going to edit that out. I'm just going to pop something else. Megan, just to recap on some of those behaviours, you mentioned these behaviours associated with disorder, that can be associated with disordered eating, can include cutting out whole food groups, being scared of certain food groups. You gave the example of carbohydrate intake, ignoring hunger cues, exercise behaviours, exercising more to burn more calories, being fearful of eating on rest days because there's not the normal energy expenditure. This podcast has a large endurance sports following, coaches, athletes, practitioners. I think most endurance athletes, if they're honest with themselves, would have a hard time not saying, oh gosh, I relate with many of those. Is there anything you would say to encourage listeners to not put walls up around this conversation, but to actually lean into it with open ears, recognizing that the irony of being aware of this can be better health, of course, which has to come first, but performance-driven individual, ultimately better performance. So anything you just say to, I guess, soften any walls that might naturally go up around this?
Yeah. And that's a very valid point there. And I think all of us have some disordered eating behaviors if we're willing to look at our own habits and our food intake. And this just comes from an early age, what we're taught growing up about food. But in particular for athletes, they can be at a higher risk for this. Especially because of personality traits and stuff like that. So I would just encourage all listeners to come into this conversation open and being willing to look at their own exercise and food habits, and being willing to take a look and see if maybe they have some potential things that need to be looked at. And even if they find that maybe they don't have any areas that need to be addressed. Maybe it'll open their eyes to friends or family members that are struggling and they're just not even aware of it. So even if people are thinking, oh, this isn't something that I'm struggling with, it's a thing that a lot of people do struggle with. So regardless, it can help maybe them identify somebody in their life that might be struggling.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. What is the prevalence? Obviously, it's difficult because it's, I guess, hard to be consistent with the definition and the application of this. But from best efforts in the science, the literature, and clinical practice, I guess, what's the prevalence of disordered eating? I believe it differs amongst athletes compared to the general population, which would make sense.
Yeah, it's hard to give an actual percentage because most studies aren't using like the gold standard for identifying athletes with eating disorders. But what we do have a better grasp on is particular groups that are at higher risk for eating disorders or disordered eating. So what we do know is that athletes are at higher risk than the general population. So we tend to see a higher percentage of athletes than non-athletes to be at risk of disordered eating. And we tend to see a higher risk in athletes that are participating in particular sports. So these would be our sports where there's weight class categories. So this would be a sport like rowing or wrestling where your body weight determines who you're competing against. These athletes tend to be at a higher risk. Also, athletes that are participating in sports that have an aesthetic component. So a sport like gymnastics would be an example. And then finally, sports where having a low body weight can have a competitive advantage. So things like cycling or running, where a lower weight is perceived as being performance enhancing. So athletes in these sports tend to be at a higher risk. The prevalence rate also tends to be higher in females than males, but that certainly doesn't mean that males can't suffer with disordered eating. They certainly can. It just tends to be that females are at higher risk.
Which I think is a very important point, right? That this is not a female-only conversation,
Mm-hmm.
an athlete conversation, and circa 50% of the planet's athletes are males. So let's ensure that males are part of this conversation as well. You mentioned the higher risk populations with weight-sensitive sports, the aesthetic sports, gravitational leanness type sports, running, endurance, triathlon, and the weight class sports. I think I certainly have heard of disordered eating behaviours in athletes in sports that kind of sit outside of that as well, like everything from volleyball to swimming through to track and field, sprinting. So this can be pervasive across all sports, but they are the higher risk sports, correct?
Yeah. And you make a good point there too, with like males, even if we tend to see higher prevalence rates in some of these other sports or females, it doesn't mean that it doesn't occur there. It certainly does. And the other issue with it is because it's not talked about as much, it can be harder for athletes to get help in these sports because people think that it isn't a problem, or because it's a male athlete that they couldn't possibly be suffering from disordered eating. So it's often harder for athletes in these other sports or male athletes to get help. And with this prevalence data as well, looking at risk of eating disorders across different sports, it's also important to remember that sometimes there may be underreporting in some of these sports, especially for things like male athletes, because they may be scared to speak up, or they may be fearful of being truthful in these surveys and different means. So even though we tend to find that there's higher risk in female populations, it could be as well that there's just underreporting.
Gosh, that's such an important point. Wow. Makes, I guess, looking at this scientifically quite challenging because you're up against societal pressures, gender biases, belief systems. It's a big topic, right? The risk factors for disordered eating and eating disorders, Megan, what are some of the risk factors that can can lead to disordered eating, or at the other end of the spectrum, a full frank eating disorder?
Yeah, there's many different risk factors. One of the ones that's talked about the most, or being the highest risk factor for eating disorder development, is actually dieting. So somebody deciding to go on a diet for well-intentioned means, maybe it's to improve health or improve performance, and this can easily just spiral into an eating disorder. So somebody starting on a diet can be a really big risk factor for disordered eating development. But then there can be some other things like personality traits. And this could be why athletes in general are at higher risk. So things like perfectionism can put somebody at a higher risk. There's genetic factors. So eating disorders has a large genetic component to it as well. It could be things like change in somebody's life. So often eating disorders can be precipitated when somebody goes through a big life change, like maybe they move to a new city, or they're starting off at university and moving away from the first time, or even just big changes in life, like the COVID-19 pandemic. What research is showing is that eating disorder rates just skyrocketed during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was a way to deal with some of the mental health concerns that came with the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, there's a lot of different risk factors that can put somebody at risk. And another one I should mention as well is an athlete getting injured. So an athlete all of a sudden not being able to participate in sport anymore, and then really trying to manage their injury through the food that they're eating.
Gosh, I'm pleased you mentioned that. Certainly as a sports physiotherapist, that's something I come across routinely, and that is changes in fueling or eating behaviours around people's injuries, whether it's a bone stress injury and that big reduction in energy output that the athlete fears will result in weight gain, yet the body needs fuel to heal. And so there's often that shortfall, which brings about a set of challenges in and of itself. Talking about risk factors, anything else that sort of pops up? I know there's this idea of body dissatisfaction and body image, which I've read in the AIS guidelines for disordered eating can be split into an athletic body image and also a social body image, which I find really fascinating. That, of course, it makes sense that there can be two body images that an athlete has of themselves. Can you speak to that in terms of your clinical and research experience?
Yeah, it's a really interesting component, because oftentimes the body image that is associated with performance enhancement in sport isn't always the ideal body image in society. So for instance, maybe for a female athlete, being larger and more muscular and taller is performance enhancing. But then within cultural, it tends to be the more skinny or thin female. And we tend to see the opposite with guys and sports, where maybe being slimmer is performance enhancing. But outside in society, there can be a different ideal body image, and they can tend to go against each other. And this in itself can cause body dissatisfaction. And like you said, poor body image and body dissatisfaction can also be a risk factor for eating disorder development. Yeah,
gosh, I'm the father of three young, beautiful girls, and they're all one's a toddler, but not even a toddler, sorry, an infant. But they're very different girls. That's genetics. And in speaking with athletes and hearing their beliefs about their body image and the self-awareness, it can be really confronting. We've featured athletes on this program, on the featured performer episodes, where they have had all sorts of encounters with the public, coaches, sponsors, through their athletic journey around the apparent or seeming mismatch between their body shape and the typical performance attributes of performers in their sport. And it's really challenging and confronting.
Yeah, and that's a good point that I didn't raise either. For these elite athletes, people are always commenting on their body, and often they're having to perform in clothing that is really revealing of their body. If we think of what some of the female runners go on and perform on, and commentators and the public feel free to make comments on their body, which is wrong and can be really harmful for them when they go and they hear these comments.
Absolutely. I think we all need to be mindful of what we say and how we say it. I had a realization as a practitioner where, just as a general, what I thought was an encouraging comment that I would often share with athletes years ago, you're looking fit. And then I thought, what does that mean? And what message is that sending? And what perhaps maladaptive behaviours is that reinforcing? What does that mean? So I've stopped saying that, and I greet people differently.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's something I really encourage people, is to just not comment on other people's weight or their appearance, because you could say something like, oh yeah, you're looking really fit, or you're looking really good. And you mean it in a very well-intentioned way, but you don't know the behaviors that athlete is partaking in. Maybe they're partaking in disordered eating behaviors and they're aware of that. And when they're getting reinforced by hearing then from coaches and other people that they're looking good, they feel like that they have to continue on with these behaviors. So it really reinforces the behavior. So just, really trying to avoid comments about body weight, even though a lot of the times they're meant to be well-intentioned, they can have more harm than good.
Yeah, gosh. It also, Megan, makes me think of the young, growing, aspiring athlete looking at their Olympic heroes and champions and champions, but their viewing lens is, the smallest of margins of that athlete's year-round body composition. We view them when they're competing at their prime, tapered, often having gone through well-structured leanness preparation for an endurance event. And yet we can mistakenly believe that that's how these athletes are year round, but we don't see that after the Olympics for the 10,000 meter track final, that athlete goes and healthily puts extra kilos on their body frame. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well, is we don't see the year round behaviors of these high performing athletes when we're looking at aspirational performances. We only see the often tapered versions.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. And even elite athletes will say that themselves. They're only at that body composition and that body weight for maybe one race of the whole year. And then they go and they gain the weight back because they know for themselves that they can't sit at that body weight because they'll just end up injured or hurt because of it. It's not that weight isn't conducive for health. So even for these elite athletes, they're working closely with a team of healthcare providers that help them get to that weight, but they're only there for one day or a very short time period. So it's important for people that are going and seeing these athletes to remember that these elite athletes don't look like that all year round. And there's also a genetic component to it as well, which you brought up before, talking about kind of how we're all built differently. A lot of these elite athletes are just leaner built too than the general population. And it's important to remember that too. They don't look like that all year round, but for a lot of them, they're just genetically of a leaner build.
Yeah, it's a strong points, and we need to keep this in mind. Megan, identification, early assessment of disordered eating behaviours is paramount. What advice have you got to people around athletes and athletes themselves, I guess, around being aware of this, having an index of suspicion, being on the lookout?
Yeah. And really teammates and coaches and family members and friends are usually the people that are going to be able to first notice when somebody's struggling with their eating habits. So looking for changes, and this could be things like it may not even be changes in body weight, but somebody being more withdrawn. Maybe they're not willing to take in social activities that involve food. Maybe noticing that all of a sudden they're not eating certain types of food, like I said before, maybe they're cutting out all bread products or they're cutting out all dairy products. So changes in eating habits. It could also be all of a sudden drops off in performance. So maybe they're not performing as well, or they're more tired or more lethargic. So there can be these really subtle changes that family members and friends can start to notice that might be an early warning sign. And it's really important to address as soon as possible, because early identification and treatment does lead to better outcomes. So if somebody is noticing that an athlete is struggling, having a conversation with that athlete, if that person's comfortable and close to them, and not making it confrontational. So even if you did notice weight gain, not saying to the athlete, oh, I've noticed that you've lost a whole bunch of weight, and making it weight focused, but instead addressing concern over that athlete's well-being. So saying, I've been noticing that you haven't been as happy lately, and I've been a little bit concerned about your performance. So again, taking it off of the weight and instead on the behaviors that are of concern with the athlete.
Gosh, that's a great point. Take it away from the weight and put it to the behaviours of the athlete. And what was the question again? Asking or comment saying, I noticed that you haven't. What was that again, Megan?
You haven't been as happy, or you've been more withdrawn lately.
Notice that you haven't been as happy. You've been more withdrawn.
Yeah.
How do these behaviours, which are many and varied, and they can change, they're not set in stone, obviously. How does an athlete that's been identified with some disordered eating behaviours best be managed? It involves obviously a multidisciplinary input. Not every athlete, obviously in high performance sports, there is a multidisciplinary team around these athletes. But what are the management tips here?
Yeah, it'll really depend on the athlete and what they're struggling with in particular, and their individual scenario. So really making sure that they're getting to a doctor for a diagnosis and just medical check, a dietitian as well that can just help make sure that their eating behaviors are more better managed. So certainly having a medical care physician there monitoring things, and a dietitian as well, but also recognizing that the resources that are going to be available are really dependent from athlete to athlete. And I recognize that not a lot of people have access to a dietitian. Thankfully, a lot of elite athletes do as part of their management team. But for a lot of recreational athletes, and I think we'll talk about this more, there isn't as much help and assistance there. And this just lets things go more unnoticed and get worse with time. So I would say for any athlete that is struggling, trying to get to a physician who can then refer them on to a dietitian or other resources that are available in their community. And I know you have international listeners, so it becomes more complicated because the help that is available is really going to differ from country to country.
But I think the key commonality there, no matter what the geography, Megan, is help. If you notice something, or you self-reflect as the athlete, or if you're part of the care team, lean in with your best efforts, with wisdom and sensitivity, and have a discussion. It's paramount to not only their health, but obviously performance, and people are there that can help. Yeah.
And I think with that too, even if an athlete or somebody listening to this, even if somebody hasn't raised concern to you about your eating habits, if you think you're sick with disordered eating tendency, if you're preoccupied with food and diet and exercise, you deserve help. So even if somebody hasn't identified it in you and brought it up with you, if you think you're struggling with this, you probably are struggling with this. And I would just encourage the listener to try to seek out help, whether it be going to their physician or reaching out to somebody that can just help them find the support they need.
That was powerful. If you think you are struggling, you probably are struggling with this.
Yeah.
Gosh. And certainly there's all manners of physicians. Not everyone will have a sports physician accessible, but sports-based practitioners in terms of athletes can certainly bring that dynamic to the care that general practitioners may not have as much. Anything you'd sort of add to that?
Yeah. Sorry, what was that last point there?
Megan, I just mentioned that any help's better than no help, but certainly if people can proactively try and align themselves with practitioners that do identify with sports as either a formal title or an area of interest, I think the care can sometimes be heightened as a result of that sports training that the practitioner, whether it's a medical doctor, dietitian, psychologist, has.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And even if it's not a sports physician that somebody's able to get help from, trying to find a physician that has knowledge and expertise in disordered eating or eating disorders. Because I think another thing is, thankfully, I do think it's changing, but oftentimes some physician and healthcare providers think that an eating disorder is only a concern when somebody's severely underweight in that typical anorexia that we think about, even though we know that eating disorders can occur in any body size. And for athletes, they may appear healthy to a healthcare practitioner, but they could really be struggling. So finding in particular a healthcare provider that has knowledge about that, whether it be a sports physician or a healthcare provider that just has knowledge of disordered eating or eating disorders is really really important. And recognizing as well, if you do go to a physician and they don't validate your concerns or they don't seem to think that you're sick enough, going and trying to get input from somebody else instead, because I've also heard stories of people going to healthcare providers for help and they're essentially told that they're not sick enough to get help. But I would just say with that, like everybody deserves help if they're struggling, even if they're told that they're not sick enough. So going and seeking help elsewhere. Everybody
deserves help. And without being alarmist, the Australian Institute of Sport Disordered Eating in High Performance Sport Position statement references that of all mental illnesses, eating disorders are associated with some of the highest death rates, and disordered eating is on this continuum towards diagnosed eating disorders. So I think it's perhaps worth stating that these aren't insignificant conversations, depending on the context.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Megan, on the role of a dietitian, yourself, you're a registered dietitian. As a sports physiotherapist, I find it hard to see that any athlete, recreational, beginner, obviously through to the elite high performance athlete, doesn't require or wouldn't benefit, I should say, rephrase, the services or the oversight or the expertise that a dietitian can deploy. It's every bit as important as their physical health that the physiotherapist, for example, may manage, broadly speaking. Yet I think in the junior populations, there can still be, with parents, some reticence around, sometimes they perceive it as a threat. Well, I'm feeding my child well, whatever. They're getting enough food. There can be barriers to that. Anything you just share with the parents or the young athlete, that we're not just talking about what type of food. Dietitians, aren't just there to look at what type of food people are eating. They're looking at so much more. Anything you'd share around the barriers to people perhaps feeling like they don't need a dietitian's input?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think a lot of people, because we all eat every single day and there's nutrition advice coming everywhere, that we sometimes think we're experts in nutrition because of that, especially, like I said, with all the free information that's online. But I would say, everybody would benefit from seeing a dietitian, I think, in some way, to just have an extra look at the diet to see if there's any changes that can be made, or maybe it's no changes need to be made and it's just kind of like a double check to make sure everything's on the same way. But I mean, even for myself, I'm specialized in sports nutrition. I've gone to school for many years to gain this knowledge and expertise. But I know for myself, I don't have knowledge in other areas of dietetics. So for instance, I don't have kids, but if I did have a baby and I needed help with nutrition for an infant, I would go and see a dietitian, even as a dietitian. So I think for the general public who don't have any specialized training in nutrition, it won't hurt to go and get some extra input from dietitians that have spent years studying this and just have expertise. And it can really be seen as an investment as well. And oftentimes it can just be a one-off appointment, just needing to see a dietitian once rather than continued care. But they can provide a lot of good input.
Absolutely. Here. I find it interesting that people will invest their time, energy, resources into an injury rehabilitation process. Mm-hmm. A professional like myself, physical therapists or allied health professionals, yet the sort of year-round monitoring and incredible input that a dietitian may be able to deploy can sometimes not be appreciated. So thank you for that, Megan. Megan, your work with your research has been also heavily focused around, or has been heavily focused around, relative energy deficiency in sport. It's not a new topic for the Physical Performance Show listenership, but I don't think it can be spoken about enough. It is permeating out there amongst the sporting population and in awareness. But what links have you seen between this topic we're discussing today, disordered eating, and the onset of relative energy deficiency in sport?
Yeah, so certainly disordered eating can lead to REDS, which I know you've discussed a lot about on your podcast before, which is fantastic. So like I said at the beginning, sometimes disordered eating can lead an athlete to not consume enough calories, in which case they can develop REDS. But I think another important point to consider is that it's bidirectional. So somebody who develops REDS or who doesn't consume enough calories, this can spiral into an eating disorder. So for instance, maybe somebody unintentionally doesn't eat enough calories and they develop REDS and they lose weight, but then these behaviors are being reinforced by those around them. This can then develop into an eating disorder. So an example could be, let's say an athlete gets sick and unintentionally loses some weight. And then their coaches start to mention, oh, they look really good. You look really good. You've lost weight. And maybe they notice an initial performance enhancement, even though that didn't occur intentionally, the weight loss and the inadequate energy intake. The positive reinforcement can then reinforce those behaviors, and it can cause that athlete to develop an eating disorder. So even though disordered eating can lead to REDS, we also know that not eating enough calories can also lead to disordered eating, and they can go back and forth and really work together.
It's bidirectional. And many of the health and performance consequences and decrements and risk factors and behaviours of disordered eating do overlap with those associated with relative energy deficiency in sport. Anything you'd share, Megan, around the, I guess, identification of RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport, REDS, separate from the identification of disordered eating?
Sorry, like how you kind of separately diagnose them, or?
Yeah, in the sense that disordered eating won't always lead to relative energy deficiency in sport, but it can. So perhaps a better question is just a recap or a refresher, some revision around how to identify relative energy deficiency in sport.
Right. Yeah. And this is a tough one because there is no universal way to diagnose or identify athletes with RADS. So it's really looking for those symptoms of low energy availability. So in females, it can be loss of periods or irregular periods. So menstrual dysfunction. In males, it can lead to low testosterone levels. So it may lead to things like low sex drive. You also see things like an increased risk of injury and illness. So an athlete that continues to get injured, maybe they get bone stress injuries. This could be a risk factor as well for it. And it could even be more subtle things like all of a sudden they're more irritable. They find that they're not responding as well to training anymore. They're not recovering as well. This too could point to not enough calorie intake. So those would be kind of the big things. And then also you could tell from some blood markers as well. So things like low thyroid levels could be a sign of inadequate energy intake as well. And there's newer research to suggest that low ferritin levels as well could be a warning sign of low energy availability.
Because that's something I've seen you educate around before, is iron status of athletes. So a little bit more around that. Low ferritin levels may be a sign of.
Yeah. So, of course, low ferritin levels can occur if somebody's not getting enough iron in their diet, but somebody could be not getting enough iron in their diet because they're not eating enough calories. For an athlete that's not consuming enough calories, it's going to be pretty hard to meet their iron stores. So poor energy intake can lead to low iron stores or low ferritin levels because of that. But there's also newer research to suggest that low energy availability or inadequate energy intake raises the level of a hormone called hepcidin. And hepcidin interferes with iron absorption. So this newer research suggests that the elevated levels of hepcidin can increase the risk of an athlete developing iron deficiency. So even if an athlete is getting enough iron in their diet, if they have really high levels of hepcidin, they're not going to be storing or they're not going to be absorbing iron as well. So what research is showing is that in athletes with REDS or low energy availability, there tends to be a higher prevalence rate of iron deficiency.
Fascinating. Makes sense intuitively, but I'm pleased you have outlined that. Megan, you mentioned that we use surrogate markers or measures, if you like, these indirect measures for detecting or diagnosing relative energy deficiency in sport. And you mentioned amenorrhea. It can be prevalent or can occur in up to 66% of athletes, it's been reported. Yet there can still be a belief that menstrual irregularity or missing cycles, excluding medical conditions that can account for this, of course, is a desirable state for an athlete. I think that that belief is fading, which is fortunate, but there's still a way to go, I believe, from my experience. What would you say to, we're speaking obviously the female athletes here, around their menstruation function and this concept of amenorrhea?
Yeah, so I would just say anytime a period goes missing or is irregular, it needs to be taken seriously, and that this isn't normal or a sign that somebody is fit, but rather it's a sign that something isn't functioning right in the body. So really, female athletes should be using their menstrual cycle as a marker of their health status. So if all of a sudden they're noticing changes in their menstrual cycle, this could be a sign that something isn't functioning properly. So I would just take note of that. And also remember, for athletes, the female athlete, they may see their menstrual cycle as a pain to have to deal with, and maybe they're happy when it goes because then they don't have to deal with kind of all the side effects that come along with it. But also remembering that those cyclical changes in sex hormones that occur across the menstrual cycle are extremely important for health. And we want this as females. So if a female is missing their menstrual cycle, they're going to have really low levels of estrogen. And estrogen is extremely health promoting. So we need to be concerned because if a period goes missing, because of those levels of estrogen are going to impact various different physiological symptoms. So things like bone health and cardiovascular health. So it is really important that a female is getting their menstrual cycle every month.
And for the male athletes, it's documented, and I think increasingly becoming known that sex drive, erectile function can be a surrogate for energy availability as well.
Yes, that's correct. And I mean, females are lucky in that the menstrual cycle can be kind of a quick way to identify that an athlete does have REDS. And males, of course, don't have this. This is a quick sign that something's right. But like you said, low testosterone levels can be caused by inadequate energy intake. So erectile dysfunction, lack of sex drive in males can also be a sign of inadequate fueling. And
prior guests of the show, colleague of yours, Rennie McGregor, fellow dietitian, sports dietitian, your academic colleague there, Margot Mountjoy, have done a good job in bringing it to the listenership of this attention that morning erections are typically a sign of health for the male athlete.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I should just mention as well, for the female athlete, if they're on hormonal contraceptives, they're going to be getting a monthly withdrawal bleed, regardless if they have menstrual dysfunction. So for a female athlete that's listening, if they're taking hormonal contraceptives, the monthly withdrawal bleed is not the same as a normal menstrual cycle, which a lot of females don't know. They think, oh, I'm on a hormonal contraceptive pill, I'm getting my period every month, but it's not the same thing. And they would have to go off the hormonal contraceptive pill to know if they're getting a regular menstrual cycle.
That's a key point. It's an easy trap to fall into. Understandable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Megan, you are very passionate about female representation in the science. You put up a great little infographic on your Instagram gallery, Megan Kuikman, at Megan Kuikman RD on Instagram, that 23% of 35,000 thereabouts participants in research, as an example, 23% were females, 77% were males. Anything you just bring to the listenership's attention around this important difference in representation and the consequences of this?
Yeah. So my PhD work is really focusing on female representation in research. And what we tend to find is most research is conducted in male athletes. And then the results or the guidelines are applied to female athletes, just assuming that males and females are going to respond in the same way. But we do know that males and females are very different. And just because something works for male athletes doesn't mean it's going to work in female athletes as well. So my research is really focusing on identifying these gender gaps in research and areas where research specific to the female athlete is needed. So you mentioned the stats from a paper that I was able to work on, looking at the representation of female athletes and research looking at performance supplements. I'm also working on an audit right now, and hopefully the results will be published soon, but I audited all the research looking at the representation of females in research that's led to the carbohydrate guidelines. And only about 11% of participants, and this was over nearly 1,000 studies, were women. So what we see is most research is done in males, and it's assumed to work the same in females.
Gosh, thinking about animal, it'd be equivalent, I guess, veterinary research and science applying the same principles to four-legged animals. Yet cats and dogs are very different. Not calling men and women cats and dogs, but when you think about it, it's quite interesting. As you say, we can't assume that males and females respond the same because they don't. Very different, as we've discussed today. Megan, you do, I should say, have some, obviously, as a academic, some further studies coming up. And I believe you are looking for some. You're based in Canberra, doing your work through the Australian Catholic University. You do have some studies coming up, which you'd be looking for some participants for. Can you just touch on those? We may be able to help as a listenership.
Yeah, if anybody is listening to this and they're based in Canberra or able to come down here for a bit, we have a study coming up soon for cyclists that's looking at resting metabolic rate, and you would get a DEXA scan with it as well. So any cyclist in the area, we have a study that may be of interest to them, and I can, if they start to follow me on Instagram, I can put information there. But the other big one that your listeners might be interested in is for runners. And it's starting in October, and it's a 5-week training camp that would be up in Perisher. So it would include a 5-week training camp at altitude. All food would be covered for it and all those things. So if participants are interested in partaking in some of these studies, it's a really cool experience. And you get a lot of cool data from it too. Things like I said, like DEXA scans, resting metabolic rate, that may be of interest to athletes.
I think any Canberra-based, was that altitude camp for the runners or the cyclists? Because I think you'll have a few people coming your way. Who wouldn't want?
Yeah. So the one that's in Canberra that's starting soon is for, it can be cyclists or it can just be people that do cross training for cycling. So maybe they're runners that do cycling a couple times a week or triathletes. That's the one that's based here in Canberra. And then the one that's at altitude in Perisher, that one's for the runners. So it would include a little bit of time in Canberra, and then we would send you up to Perisher for 3 or 4 weeks. We have a great chef that cooks all the meals for them too, and the chef is like amazing. So it's a really good time if people are able to make it work with their schedules. And that one's set to begin end of October, I believe.
Okay, brilliant. Call to arms for the listenership. Megan, every guest of the show, as you know, is asked 2 set questions. And the first is this: if you could boil everything you've learnt and are learning into one single piece of advice to help listeners of this show perform at their physical best, what would that single piece of advice be?
Yeah, so my piece of advice would be when they're getting nutrition advice or exercise advice, try to take into consideration their personal circumstances and that it's individualized to them. So often I hear nutrition advice being given, and it may be appropriate for one individual, but it doesn't mean that it's appropriate for another individual. So an example would be things like nutrition information surrounding carbohydrate guidelines. Somebody's saying, oh, we shouldn't be eating carbohydrates. Maybe that's appropriate for somebody that's struggling with type 2 diabetes, but that's not an appropriate piece of nutrition advice for an athlete. So I would say that making sure that all nutrition advice and all things that are being implemented in diet are individualized and specific to that athlete and their specific circumstances.
Gosh, powerful. A good reminder for all. Megan, every guest issues a physical challenge for the week. You've already touched on that. You've done some pre-work on this. So what is Megan Kuikman's physical challenge to the listenership going to be?
Yeah, mine is going to be to take a spontaneous rest day. Athletes are extremely motivated individuals, and it usually takes more discipline for them to take a rest day than to go on with their training schedule. So my physical challenge would be if there's a day that you just wake up and you're feeling off, maybe you're feeling a little bit more sore, you're just feeling a little bit under the weather, to listen to your body and to take a rest day rather than going out and doing that exercise bout. Because even though it's often harder, like I said, and takes more self-discipline to not go ahead with it, often it's what your body needs. And in the long run, you're going to benefit from it because you're going to reduce your risk of getting injured and ill. And maybe you just need some extra rest so you can perform even better the next day.
Take a spontaneous rest day. It is a challenge and it will take discipline, but let's give it a go. You're easily found over on Instagram. Your Twitter handle's the same, Megan Kuikman, Kuikmanrd. We'll link everything up in the show notes. It's been worth the wait. We've been looking at organising this for some time. And thank you for stopping by the Physical Performance Show and sharing so generously.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.